Hey everybody, this is Unit 5 Formative 1. We're going to be finding the greatest common factor today. Alright, so greatest common factor, you'll see me abbreviate as just GCF. So whenever you see that, you know we're referring to as greatest common factor. So let's just do a couple quick examples here. We have negative 12 and 36. Greatest common factor would just be the biggest number that can go into both negative 12 and 36. Well, we know that 12 goes into 36, and 12 obviously goes into itself, so the greatest common factor in this case would be negative 12. Or if you said positive 12, that's fine as well, but negative 12 would go into 36 and negative 12. Okay, then we look at 5x and 10x cubed. Well, the first thing you want to look at, ignore the x's and just think about the 5 and the 10. The biggest thing that will go into 5 and 10 is going to be 5. Okay, because 5 goes into 5, obviously, and 5 also goes into 10. Nothing bigger than 5 will go into 5, so it has to be 5 or something smaller. And then we look at the x and the x cubed. Well, you can take an x out of the x, and you could take a single x out of the x cubed, so the greatest common factor would just be 5x. Okay, if this one right here were a 5x squared, then your greatest common factor would be x squared. Okay, so the variable that is the greatest common factor is always the least exponent. Alright, so where you'll see this is more in polynomials. So for example, this binomial here, you'll have to pull out a greatest common factor. So the greatest common factor, we just look at it the same way that I just showed you. So the greatest common factor between 6x and 12, well, there's not an x in the 12, so we just have to worry about the numbers. So the greatest common factor between 6 and 12 would just be a 6, because 6 goes into 6 one time and 6 goes into 12 two times, and then there's no x's on the 12, so we can't pull an x out of both of them. Alright, this one here would be a trinomial, so we're going to look for the greatest common factor between these three terms. So first let's look at the numbers out front, the negative 5, the 25, and the 45. So the greatest common factor between those three numbers has to be, first you want to look at the smallest of the three, which is negative 5. Okay, so the greatest common factor is not going to be any bigger than 5. Well, if we look, all three of these end in a 5, so we know that 5 is going to go into all three of these. So negative 5 would be the greatest common factor of the three numbers out front. And then we have an x squared. We have an x, and then we have another x here. So the biggest amount of x's that you could pull out of all of them would just be a single x. So it's not going to be x squared, it's just going to be negative 5x would be your greatest common factor. Alright, did you know that honey is the only food that will never spoil? Alright, and now we're going to look at this last one here. So we have, first, let's look at the numbers out front. So we have negative 12, negative 24, and 36. Biggest thing that will go into all three of those is going to be a negative 12. Okay, because 12 goes into 12, 12 goes into 24, and 12 also goes into 36. Nothing bigger than 12 will go into 12. So the number that goes into all three has to be either equal to or smaller than the smallest number there. Okay, let's look at our x's. So every term here, this one has an x squared, this one just has an x, and this one doesn't have, and the last one doesn't have an x at all. So there can't be a greatest common factor of x that we pull out of them. So we just leave the x off of the greatest common factor. But then if we look at the y's, there is a y cubed, a y, and a y squared. So we can actually pull a y out of every single one. If we pull a y out of here, you're left with y squared. This one, it would go away, and this one turns to y. But you can't pull an x out of all of them, so that's why your greatest common factor doesn't have an x in it at all. So your greatest common factor for number 3 would just be negative 12y. Alright, and that is how you find greatest common factor of a polynomial. We will talk to you later. Make sure you took good notes.